ask you one other thing.
No,
Do
you
you
didn't
see
sign
that?
up with audio.
Yeah, you
Yep.
can. Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
Leave
can.
and start
Great.
again.
So I would just encourage
Yep,
everyone
you
to put
didn't sign up with audio.
your microphones on mute. I can also mute you if there's some background noise. We have our speakers who don't need to be on mute, but everyone else will just keep you muted until we get to the portion of the evening where you can chime in. So I'm just going to wait a few more minutes as people are signing in. We're excited tonight for our 10th annual Baked Bean Supper. We've got a sold out crowd and people are starting to click in, so we'll just give it another minute. All right, well, I'm going to get started because people are still clicking in a little bit, but this way I can get going on the introduction and not keep everyone waiting. I'm going to spotlight myself for everyone. Hello, welcome to the 10th annual Baked Bean Supper for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. If we haven't had an opportunity to meet, my name is Rainey Bench and I am the Executive Director for the MDI Historical Society. And previous to that, I had the really great fortune of serving on the board of directors. So I think I have participated in almost all of the Baked Bean Suppers to date in some capacity or another. And despite the fact that this is a very odd year and a very odd experience doing a virtual Baked Bean Supper, the Historical Society felt really committed to continuing this tradition, mostly to try and bring people together. We're all isolated and feeling the strain of the ongoing pandemic and probably some isolation and loneliness if you're anything like me. Then we really wanted to stick with that feeling of camaraderie and community. So as a result, we have this really weird format where you can all see tiny little squares of each other, sort of like Hollywood squares. If you notice as you move your cursor, you will be able to click left or right to be able to view the other people who are here with us on the presentation. You're automatically muted as you've come in. So if there's any background noise or things that happen, that way it won't distract from the overall presentation. But towards the end of the evening, we'll have a chance to unmute if you have something you want to share. But I would also encourage you down at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat feature. So if you click on the little chat button, you can type something in and I'll have a chance to see that and make sure that it gets folded into the conversation. So later in the evening, we're going to ask if anyone cooked any of the recipes from our cookbook that they received. If you have any baking tips or secrets or ingredients that you want to share, there'll be an opportunity in the chat feature. And we'll also hopefully be able to share with one another on the other screen.
Get louder.
So even though you are muted, your microphone is muted, you can turn your camera on. So either way, you're welcome to do that so that you can see one another. So that's just a little bit about how the evening is going to work in terms of the Zoom piece. We are recording this, so we'll be able to share this out for people in the future. So the mission of the Society is to foster meaningful engagement with the histories of MDI. And one of these really great histories is the Bean Supper, bringing people together for a community dinner and a way to share stories, recipes, argue about ingredients, all sorts of different things. But really the purpose is to bond together as a community, to see one another face to face, to share a laugh, to hug each other and pat each other on the back and comfort one another in times of crisis or sadness. And so I hope that next year when we gather for the 11th annual Baked Bean Supper, we will be able to do all of those things together in person. I do want to share a quick moment with you. This Baked Bean Supper has, as I said, been a really great tradition that we've had for a long time, 10 years now in the making. And we have some really great speakers with us, and I'm going to toss over to Dennis Damon, who's going to be our master of ceremony for the evening. So thank you. And Dennis, if you want to say a welcome and introduce our speakers.
Well, yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can. All right. So I'm glad that all of you have decided to join us tonight for the MDI Historical Society's 10th annual Baked Bean Supper, as Rainey has mentioned. I haven't been to all 10 of them, but the ones that I have gone to have been interesting and fun. I've always met people that I never knew before. That's kind of hard to do when you live on an island and you're as old as I am. But there's always been interest in presentations after supper too. So I hope this follows into that same tradition. As you know, the MDI Historical Society depends on your fellowship and your funds for it to keep doing the important work of preserving and protecting our local history. I read an interesting quote recently from the director of the South Portland Historical Society. She said, "How can you develop policy if you don't know what's happened before?" Again, part of the preservation, the protection, and the education, which is all embodied in the mission of the MDI Historical Society. Well, we've got a great group who've agreed to join me tonight on the panel, and they'll be interspersed through this next hour. They are Dr. William Horner, just call me Bill, former board chair of the MDI Historical Society; Sharon Joyce, who is the owner of Ambrosia Cooking School in Bar Harbor and the author of A Culinary History of Downeast, Maine, which is available at Sherman's bookstore in Bar Harbor, I believe; and Earl Brechlin, who may be familiar to some as the former editor of the Bar Harbor Times, the former editor of the Mount Desert Islander, and soon to be the former communications director of the Friends of Acadia. There's a lot of formers in there, Earl. He too is an author whose books are available at Sherman's and other fine bookstores throughout Maine. But I'll let him tell you all about that. So, Earl, if you're there and you can hear me, you're on, buddy. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dennis, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this event tonight with these esteemed speakers, and also it's so wonderful to see such familiar names and faces out there in this event and celebration of Mount Desert Island history. Kind of as a leadoff batter tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about Raymond Strout, who was a wonderful friend and I think an incredible historical resource for this island. And Raymond's shop, Alblad's, behind what's now Tailgate Sports, was certainly one of those special and magical places on the island. And I had the good fortune, a close friend of mine worked in his shop, and I spent a lot of time in there. And I always marveled how it was Hoarders before there was an episode of Hoarders. There was a narrow aisle through the shop, and there were piles of prints and maps and framed items and moldings. And Raymond knew exactly where everything was. He had a collection, I think, that in many ways rivaled certainly the MDI Historical Society, Bar Harbor Historical Society, Southwest Harbor, and others. And I wanted to share with you a story about Raymond because I think it really showed that impish nature that he had, and also that Mainer practicality. And some years back, when a large and wealthy person who was a lifestyle mogul who decided to move to Mount Desert Island, it didn't take long before she heard that she needed to visit Raymond's shop and find out more about local history, particularly with her interest in old maps. And so Raymond would recount for several months in a row how the staff from New York would call and say that this person would be up this weekend on their private jet and would like to come by on Saturday to see his collection. Well, Raymond, in typical taciturn manner, would say, if I'm here, I'm open. And Saturday was when Raymond went to a lot of auctions. So over a 6-month period, I think 5 different times this person came to his shop and found the close sign on the door because Raymond had something else to do. And I think he kept it all in perfect perspective. And then when this person finally came by and he was there one day and he welcomed her in with his usual charm and understated nature. And the first thing she did was point to a collector's item Necco wafer jar from the original Necco wafers and said, what's the price on that? And Raymond said, not for sale. And then went along and saw a large map of Mount Desert Island and said, would you be willing to sell that? And Raymond said, nope, not for sale. But they did find things. I mean, after all, Raymond was a businessman and he wanted to make a good dollar. And so finally they picked out all the maps and then they started to talk about how they were going to be framed. And Raymond said, well, I really can't frame these until I see where they're going to hang. Because Raymond really wanted to get a look inside that house. But Raymond and this person became fast friends, both around each other's cell phone speed dial. And I think that just having that wellspring of history, knowledge of maps, Lisa Horsch Clark tells of the time she was trying to date a map and called Raymond and he was able to say, well, if it shows Hamilton Pond, then it's this date. And if it doesn't have Hamilton Pond, then it's that date. And he knew it all backwards and forwards. So I think it's marvelous tonight that we're dedicating this to Raymond, dedicating it really to all of you out there who really care about this island's history and work so hard to make sure that others can enjoy it as much as we do. And thank you for that. And Dennis, I'll pitch it back to you.
Thank you. While I was listening to you, Earl, that slide was up on the screen. I don't know if the other people could see it, but there were 2 views of Raymond, one bearded and one shorn, and then there was some guy in between him that was taking up some space. I don't know where you got that picture from. Raymond indeed was a true treasure to Mount Desert Island. As we have a number of others, not only on the island, but in the surrounding communities. And your story of Raymond reminded me of a couple of fellas who live on a neighboring island that I won't name. And they had real names, but I won't use them either because they had nicknames. And so if you knew them, you would know their nicknames. And if you don't know them, then just listen to the story. It seems that Todd and Tinker were on the wharf on their island, and a bunch of tourists come by, and they was marveling over how quaint everything looked and how beautiful everything was naturally, and couldn't get enough of this and couldn't get enough of that. And finally, a fella interjected and he says, this is all nice, but I can't really imagine what it is that you people do once we leave. I mean, we've come here, we've spent all this money, and I'm sure that that's helped you out some, but what is it that you do? So Todd looked at Tinker and Tinker looked at Todd, and Todd spoke up and says, well, sir, the first thing we do is fumigate. And then they went on. So I won't explain it. Sharon Joyce has written a fascinating book about the cooking in our area of Maine, and she's going to share some of the backstory of that book with us this evening. Sharon, before I bring you on, I know that you, in your email, you wanted to know if I had any written down recipes, and particularly you were interested in graham cracker pie. Well, I did find this recipe. It's all written down. You can't see much of it here now. It looks like a piece of paper, but I'll be sure you get it. It says Grammy's graham cracker pie. My daughter, Sadie, who's a trained pastry chef, and She made a key lime pie the other night for supper, and she garnished it with candied lime slices. And as I was cutting into it and appreciative of how good it was, I said, could this be made with graham cracker crust, like our graham cracker pie? Her response was to roll her eyes. Sometimes things never change, I guess, and say, Dad, of course it could. So what do I know? I thought I'd come up with something new, but she says no. So right now, though, I'll be sure that you get this, but I'm more interested now if you could tell us about your book and traveling around Maine and getting the recipes that you've got in your book. So Sharon, take it away.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you getting back to me about the graham cracker pie, because so many recipes, so many foods have so many different names, and it's really hard to determine what people call a graham cracker pie. And when I was growing up, graham cracker pie was a pre-made graham cracker crust and Jello chocolate pudding in it. Sometimes a key lime pie always has graham cracker crust. And the topping on a graham cracker pie would probably be meringue or whipped cream. But if not, then I can see someone putting graham crackers on top of it, like a crumble pie. So it's just interesting because there's so many different ways of doing things. I was talking to Raymond one day, and he was telling me about his childhood, and said that when he was young, his mother would send him out at low tide between Bar Harbor and Bar Island, and he would literally pick up dinner. A stray lobster or a stray fish would get stranded there. He'd go out, bring it home for dinner. Memories. People have so many memories, and I know everybody here has memories about food, celebrations, traditions, things that they've made that they really like, and of course, baked beans. I did run into beans a couple of times in the book. Then I stumbled across um, baked beans. But beans have a really long history, as the Native Americans grew beans. They planted corn, then beans, so that the beans would have something to circle around and hold themselves up. And then they planted squash to keep out bugs and insects, and also to provide nitrogen back to the soil. So beans have been around for a long time, as has corn, as different types of squash. Uh, I I was a judge for cooking uh, at the Machias Blueberry Festival. And on my way back, I saw this little sign that said yard sale. So I went off the main road, Route 1, and ended up in Columbia Falls. Well, Columbia Falls is an interesting little town because there's a lot of history there. And I found out a little bit about the history and the people, and the first woman pharmacist in the country, in Maine, not in the country, but in Maine, who lived there, who was a granddaughter of brothers, who was uh, someone who owned a lot of property and did really very well. Uh, I was interested primarily in her because I wanted to know what she was planting to eat and for medicinal purposes. And I couldn't find out very much about what the Ruggles were planting, except that they did have some animal bones in the backyard, so they were killing some kind of animals for food. Um, but the pharmacist was growing things like witch hazel and dandelions, which I'd love to talk to you all a lot about dandelions because there's quite an amazing plant if you don't kill it with Roundup. Anyway, back to the beans. I talked to someone and talked to somebody else, and they sent me to somebody else. And I came across a fellow who had done an article for a paper. The paper is no longer there. And there was this big controversy over beans. If you were from the northern part of Columbia and Columbia Falls, then you liked beans that did not have sugar. If you were from the south, they were sweetened. And he wrote this big article about this, that maybe that was why they changed, and one was Columbia Falls and one was Columbia. Um, but it was really kind of, I thought it was rather amusing that there was such a controversy over beans, and how they like to make them. They did use one bean. They said that that was the only bean that they would ever use, and that was the Marifax bean. And the Marifax bean is it's a nice, it's a nice, I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's a nice brown bush bean. It has some flavor to it. It's meaty. So that's one of them. But I did a little bit of study. Well, after that, I found Bill's article that he wrote about baked beans, about the controversy here about which beans to use. So with the recipes, there were a lot of different beans, and I thought I would try and introduce some to you. I know that there are some bean experts who are watching this, and there are probably a few people who don't know beans about these. So this is probably as much uh, for them, but I'll introduce a couple of them. This one is an interesting. This one, if you can see the bean itself. Here we go. This is a soldier bean, and it's said to look like one of the toy soldiers that you see at Christmas. And it does, yeah, it looks a little bit like that. Um, these are lima beans. No, they're not lima beans. They're great northern beans, and they're a little bit bigger than navy beans. They're all in the same family. They're all mallow, mild. Navy beans got their name because they were a bean that was used by the Navy so much. Um, they could be used for so many different things. One of the things which I haven't tried, and maybe someone out there has, is navy bean pie. I mentioned that to someone, and they said, "Oh, well, you put sugar on anything, and it tastes okay." But you can put sugar in pumpkin, and it's a pretty good pumpkin pie. So beans can be used for a lot of things. They can be substituted for a lot of things. These, I think most people know, black beans. Use that a lot in Mexican food. And the other thing that's used in Mexican food fairly often is pinto beans or acalusa beans. And these beans were called that because they kind of looked like a horse, like a pinto pony color. And so that is that one. Um, this is the bean that Bill likes. It's resembles the coloring resembles a cow or cattle, a heifer, which is an English um, cow. It has pork flavor. It holds its uh, it's the body of it in cooking, and it has a more pungent taste. Many of the beans you'll find have a very light, nutty, or fruit-like um, flavor to them. This one is a kidney bean. The reason it's called a kidney bean is because people thought it looked like a kidney. And so this again is another bean that can be used for cooking as well. This one is a yellow-eyed bean. This was mentioned in a recipe. this is an interesting bean because I couldn't find out too much about it. It's called a yellow-eyed bean, but at one time it was called yellow Indian-eyed shelling bean. Um, this is an heirloom bean too. I don't know if it's always been in Maine, but when I looked it up on Google, it said it kind of disappeared, and then some Swedish people said that they found it, and they took it to Minnesota or someplace. So again, a yellow-eyed bean, got a little yellow little spot into it.
So Sharon, for your baked bean recipe that you contributed, what was the bean that you used? What's your favorite?
The bean that I used was Marifax. It's not my favorite bean, it's just a bean. I think any of them are good. It's just what you're used to or something different, something to try. Because I ran across the Marifax bean first, I played around with that and fed some people and they seemed to like it. I have, as you can tell, a large supply of beans to try out and play with as well. But something else I'll just mention to you. When Champlain was on Mount Desert Island, 1605, he planted something that's equivalent to our lima bean. And our lima bean, it was called Brazilian bean. I couldn't really find it. But he planted that, obviously, because he had memories of that, because it was maybe a tradition, maybe he wanted it when he came back, sailing back. But it also was something that would maybe entice people to want to come and live here if they could grow the beans that they like. Now, I played around with that a little bit, the lima beans, and I found in a 1928 cookbook that was an English cookbook that I found in the early 80s when I was out in California. And I was looking through it. I've been looking through a lot of books about beans, fine beans in it. And it said the most delicious, hands down, the best taffy that you can make. So I thought, well, if they think it's that good, I'll give it a try. So I made the taffy, and it was very good, surprisingly good. Now from that, I had a lot of lima beans left over. So I thought, okay, what else could I do with this? And I found a very nice recipe for an appetizer where simple puree lima beans, a little bit of water, a little bit of olive oil, and a couple other things, and put it on a garlic toast. It was very good. So, still had a little bit of lima beans left, and I made a soup with it, a lima bean soup. Pureed it again, added some stock. It was very good. So, if you want to have a total lima bean dinner, you can have an appetizer, a soup, and dessert with lima beans. So that is basically what I have to talk about. There are a few other things in the book that are surprising to people, as far as Henry Ford being one of the early people who studied soybean. But that's another day.
Well, Sharon, thank you for that. And I think there'll be an opportunity towards the end for some questions from the people in the audience if they want more information about the book. And of course, as I understand it, the book is available at Sherman's. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I would say that Sharon, your talk has inspired a very active chat session going on right now, where lots of people are debating the merits of different beans, loving navy beans. We have a California resident who's here with us tonight talking about beans from out west. Julia Gray says at the local church bean supper, the key options are big beans and little beans. So from very specific to very general, we've got some debates about whether black beans count. So
And the,
make sure people check out the chat.
and the chickpea is, was named that because it looked like a baby chicken's head.
Oh, wow. Well, we had, let's see, Lisa Horst Clark says we had a Persian rhubarb dish this week made with chickpeas instead of meat, which sounds wonderful. So lots of great conversation going on in the chat. Keep it up. Those are really fun. Dennis, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thanks. And thanks again, Sharon. I don't know about the rest of you, but in my house, we always had beans and baths on Saturday night. Beans, I guess, the tradition, and baths because, well, there's going to be church on Sunday. And so we had to get cleaned up sometime. Which reminds me of a story of a young preacher who'd come to town. I'll use the location somewhere in Downeast, Maine, because that's where we are. Could have been just as easily over in Western Maine. Yeah, let me change it for the purposes of this. It's over in Western Maine. So he was quite nervous. He just, got his preacher's certificate, whatever that's called. And he come to town and wanted to meet some of the people, which he did. And he announced that he was the new minister, and was going to have a sermon on Sunday morning. So he thought, as he's getting ready for his sermon, preparing it and everything, that the church would be full because he's told everyone. So he shows up early, and he knows what time the sermon is supposed to begin, the church service. He gets to the pulpit, he looks out onto the pews, and there's one fella sitting out there, an old farmer in overalls, and sitting all by himself. Well, you can imagine how he felt. He had all this lead up time and had great expectations and didn't know quite what to do. So he came down off the pulpit and he came up to the old farmer and he says, "I'm awfully sorry. I was really expecting there'd be a big crowd here today, and I don't know quite what to do. I've got this sermon all prepared." And the old fella said to him, he says, "Well, now, Sonny, if I took a load of hay down in my wagon, down to the lower pasture to feed my cows, and only one cow showed up, I'd still feed her." Oh, the pastor thought, well, that gives me license to, so he goes back up onto the pulpit and he starts in with his sermon. He gets caught up in the moment. He's going through the whole thing, and it becomes quite inspiring. And finally, after quite a bit of time, he finishes the sermon. And he figures, now what do I do? Oh, I go down to the door and I greet everybody on the way out. So he got down to the door leading out of the church, and the old farmer gets up and he walks out by him. Didn't take long to greet everybody. And the preacher, he was all excited about, "So what did you think about that?" And the farmer says, "Well, I'll tell you what, Sonny, if I took a load of hay down in my wagon, down to my lower pasture, and there was only one cow showed up, I don't believe I'd give her the whole damn load." So that brings me to, I guess, Earl. Earl, you've got something about beans and lumber camps, don't you?
I do, Dennis. Thank you. And I think that story was a load in its own right. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that with us. I want to share a few pictures from Maine's logging past with folks as we talk about the tradition of baked beans, which really reached their high point in the backwoods of Maine. And as Sharon pointed out, the Indians, agriculture, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So beans was a big part of their diet, and they would cook it with maple syrup because, of course, they didn't have brown sugar, and bits of venison or fish or corn. And the logging folks, we had a lot of interactions. They certainly adopted that at the same time. And as Dennis mentioned, beans on Saturday and church on Sunday and a bath on Saturday. Well, a lot of times in Puritan New England, baking those beans on Saturday allowed there to be food without having to bake on the Sabbath. So it was a kind of a natural fit and became a big staple with New Englanders. So most lumber camps, as you can see, there's some pretty tough guys. They would go in the spring or late winter and get ready and cut trees during the winter time. And then everything got sent down the streams in the spring on the flood to mills in Bangor and other places. Well, you have all those men working 12, 14 hours a day. Of course, you've got to feed them well, and loggers ate an enormous quantity of food, as much as 8,000 calories a day each. And they worked just one shift, 10 to 12 hours. They did have Sundays off. Next slide, please. So they lived in pretty simple camps, hovels really, that were just made from the logs that were there. And when you talk about baths on Saturday night, they didn't get to take them, and they were working in wool clothing, wet, hard, sweaty work. Next slide, please. And they would sleep on these long benches that were actually spread once a week. They put fresh boughs from softwood trees, and then they were each issued a blanket. And they were told that there was mandatory that they wash that blanket at least once a year. So you take all that together and you put 40 or 50 men in these camps, and the kitchen was kind of the center of the place. Next slide. And you can see the indoor kitchen that they would do that. They baked the beans in the stoves, and the cooks would arise at 3 or 4 in the morning and get help from their assistants, which were called cookies. And they'd have breakfast ready by 6. The cook would yell out, "Daylight in the swamp," to call the men to breakfast. And no talking was allowed at meals other than to ask for food to be passed. And most meals were totally consumed in 12 or 15 minutes. Well, that was for a practical reason, is the cooks wanted the men out of the way so they could do the dishes and get ready for the next meal. Next slide. Sometimes they prepared the meal outside, particularly in the summer, so they didn't have to heat up those camps any more than they needed to. And a typical lumber camp meal consisted of breakfast, which would be oatmeal, fried potatoes, cold roast beef, baked beans, hot rolls, applesauce, donuts, cookies, and tea. That'll get you started in the morning. Lunch, which they referred to as dinner, included roast loin of pork, mashed turnips, green peas, brown gravy, baked beans, yeast bread, pineapple pie, cookies, and tea. And supper was fried potatoes, cold roast beef, baked beans, hot rolls, stewed prunes, sugar cookies, molasses cookies, and again, more tea. Next slide, please. And sometimes when they were out in the wild, the food was actually delivered to the crew, and the cookies would bundle everything up. If the situation warranted, they were also allowed to build a fire at the remote sites where the crews were and do that. And then finally, the last slide at the bottom here is a picture of what was called the bean hole, which was very carefully constructed of rocks. And they would make this big pit, and they would line it and put a fire in there and let it burn till the coals were a foot or more thick, and then put the cast iron beans in there, cover that, put more coals on top, and let it cook all day with dirt on top. So the cook at the bean hole was considered one of the primary things. Now, most lumber camps, of course, a bad cook could ruin the whole crew and cause an unsuccessful season. So if there was a bad cook, they were quickly disposed of, and they didn't want to get the reputation to be known as what was called in those times a bean burner was a bad cook. So if anyone ever calls you a bean burner, certainly know that that's something you certainly don't want to do. So on an average year, a crew of 50 men in a season would consume 60 bushels of beans, 200 bushels of potatoes, 700 pounds of margarine, 100 pounds of tea, and a vast amount of meat and other quantities. So when we think about baked beans, I don't know any of us that probably would want to have them 3 meals a day, but they're great protein, they're warm, they're filling, and I think Dr. Horner in a little bit is going to be talking about the effect of beans on the body, and you can imagine in those logging camps that that probably had a pronounced effect as well. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of toss it back to Dennis.
Well, thank you, Earl. That's fascinating. I was wondering a couple of things. You talked about cold roast beef. That certainly it's a protein. I'm wondering if at some points there must have been the substitution of deer or moose or bear for that protein piece rather than just cold roast beef.
That's true. They also had some pork loin that they would have in stock. But whenever the crews were out in the woods, and if they came across a deer or a bear, they said baking the beans with bear grease in them was the camp's favorite. Usually was the favorite recipe, and so they certainly exploited those natural foods. Of course, logging at that time was a huge environmental disaster anyway, because they would. They cut all the trees and leave the slash. And so it didn't take long for there not to be any animals either.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating again. I was also thinking when you showed the picture of the camp, the hovel, and how they slept and they ate in the same room. I believe it was all just one open room, unless of course they had a cook shack. But you would have all of that fragrance of the men's work over months and months that had been absorbed into their clothes and into their blankets, I suppose, by that time, masked only by a weekly change of fur boughs or something that they slept on, and then exacerbated perhaps by some of the meal that they ate, most notably the ones including legumes. And so I'm glad that we have Dr. Horner with us tonight, because perhaps he can go into some of the characteristics and the I don't quite know what the other words are for it, for the making of the bean into, well, another environmental hazard. I guess it's more associated with cows now. Can you tell us something about that, Bill? You're muted.
Let's see here.
There you go.
Where am I?
There you go. Who knows?
I see Earl.
He's the only one left. He's the farmer now. Down in
There
the
we go.
audience.
There we
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you all. Yeah, this is a scientific part of the program.
Mm.
And, Rainey, if you'll put up the first slide. We are going to, well, I just want to give you my credentials, first of all. I need to correct, Dennis, one minor error. Rumors of my retirement from the Historical Society board are premature. I'm still there and will be, I suspect, for some time now. But the other thing I want to point out is that before I retired, I was a general surgeon and did a lot of abdominal surgery, operating on intestines of various kinds. And in that whole process, you've done the operation, the patient is recovering, things are going well, you're hoping that everything is healing up as it should be inside. And then by the third day, the universal question to the patient is, have you passed gas? And that usually, if it's met with an affirmative response, is met with a great deal of relief on both the patient's and the surgeon's part. So I say that because I'm not afraid to talk about gas, but I am wondering if some element of the public may be, and I struggled etymologically to come up with a word that captured that sense. And aerophobia is about the best thing I could come up with. Usually it's a term used for people who are afraid of flying. But in this case, it is air, and particularly a word for air. And so I'm going to ask all of you, Rainey, could you push the space bar on the button? I'm going to ask you to momentarily unmute yourselves. I will give you a count of 10. And after I count to 10, we're all going to say the F word, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get ready. You're still some muted. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's hear it.
Art.
Bart.
Fat.
I'm not afraid.
No. Total desensitization. I'm glad we got there this quickly. And we find ourselves in good company, believe it or not, because it was back in 1781 that Benjamin Franklin, at the time, was the United States ambassador to France. He was a scientist, as you all know. You remember the key, the kite, and the electricity. And he took the Royal Academy of Brussels to task because he felt that the articles that they were publishing were, as he said, increasingly pretentious and concerned with the impractical. And so he suggested in a famous essay to the letter, it called A Letter to the Royal Academy About Farting, or for short, Fart Proudly, that they should do research to find out why there was such a problem with intestinal gas after eating, and particularly the odors emanating therefrom. So given Franklin's penchant for scientific rigor, let's turn our attention to the anatomy of a fart. Now here you see the entire human gastrointestinal tract, starting with the mouth and the esophagus. A bean, let's say a meal of beans will progress itself down to the stomach, which is a very acid environment where not much absorption takes place, but various foodstuffs are broken down. And then they go through what we call the duodenum, where it's located right under the liver and the gallbladder. You can see it illustrated there. And that's connected to the duodenum by some bile ducts. And so some bile is squirted into the mix that you've just eaten. And then the pancreas adds some digestive enzymes. And beyond that point in the journey, it begins about an 18-foot trip down through the small intestine, illustrated in purple. And that is largely where most of the absorption takes place. But there's a problem, because getting back to beans and understanding this business of gas, beans contain kind of sugar called oligosaccharides. These are rather complicated molecules that require special enzymes to be broken down entirely. The specific enzyme that we have in mind is something called alpha glucosidase. And we as humans don't have a lot of that. And so when this bolus of beans arrives down at the very end of the small bowel, where the purple and it comes close to the appendix, there's a little trap door there that opens, and billions of bacteria are waiting for this wonderful meal that's coming down. This undigested oligosaccharide. And so the bacteria go to work on this and they ferment it, and the result is the generation of a certain amount of gas. And there are a number of foods that are known to contain these oligosaccharides. The ones that are obvious, of course, are the entire legume family. But there's another group, the so-called cruciferous vegetables that George H.W. Bush didn't like. I believe that includes things like broccoli, also cabbage, garlic, onions, cauliflower. And these foods also contain a fair amount of sulfur. So the main elements, and we'll get into this in the next slide. So let's turn to the scientific literature contained in a fart. This gives the term gas chromatography an entire new dimension. But if you look closely at the right-hand slide, and you look across the top, you'll see several categories that outline these columns. One is total volume, one is hydrogen, one's carbon dioxide, one's methane. And you'll note that a fart is primarily composed of hydrogen, and to a lesser degree, carbon dioxide, and to a very small degree, methane. And all three of these gases are entirely odorless. They produce volume, as you can see in the first column, but there's virtually no odor unless one of these sulfur-containing items makes its way into the mix. And that's as far as I'm going to go with that particular subject. But I do want to call your attention. This is a scientific article that was published in the journal appropriately called Gut in June of 1991. This is a peer-reviewed journal. And in the left-hand illustration, you'll see the results of this study. It included 10 people, 10 individuals, half female and half male. And each of them, through a method that I will not describe, had their intestinal gas outlet measured over a 24-hour period. And the columns represent both the qualitative content of the gases and the amount. And so you can see that except for F5, that is female number 5, she must have been a rather dangerous person to be around from volume and hydrogen. Thank you. I just heard somebody laugh. I was going to, this is awfully hard to think you're being.
It's hard muted when we don't see and hear each other. But
well,
trust me,
I'm assuming that yeah, I'm assuming we're all laughing hilariously. And besides,
it is. There's a lot of chatter going on in the chat, Bill. So you are good and being very appreciated.
All right. Well, reminded me that it may be time for a joke, because you know, when you're talking about farts, it brings out really the best of adolescent male humor. In fact, I know some adult males who can hardly restrain themselves. But I have a quickie here. Do you know the difference between a saloon and an elephant's fart?
No, tell us.
Well, one is a bar room and the other one is a bar room. Thank you. But wait, let's
Wait,
move on.
there's things in the chat. Oh, we have the chant, the beans, the musical fruit. The more you eat, the more you chew. The more
Oh,
you
yeah.
chew, the better you feel.
Sure, we're gonna have a medley here before we know it.
Oh, and Eric thinks he went to high school with F5.
There we go. Okay, we're good. All right, folks, but wait, there's more. Rainey, that's your signal.
This slide.
Oh,
So we've covered the scientific aspect of bean consumption. I'll come back to a couple of elements of it in a moment, but I want to touch on the arts. Because believe it or not, there was a period of time when, particularly in Europe, first the English courts and then the French stage in the form of the Moulin Rouge, no less, appreciated the artistic skills of people who were referred to as flatulists. And here you see a fellow whose real name was Joseph Pujol, who was, I'm sorry, who was born in Marseille in 1857. He acquired the name Le Pétomane, which basically means in French, farting maniac. And at a young age, he was swimming one day in the sea and the water was very cold and he suddenly had this huge intake of breath and he felt this huge cold enema-like sensation and he came out of the water and coughed. This torrent of water came out of his butt. And so he practiced this. And it was scientifically studied. And he once was able to actually inhale seawater through his butt, hold it, and then the record was, I think, 15 feet that he was able to expel this jet of water. Well, we thought, that's interesting, but not particularly entertaining. Let's try air. And so, believe it or not, and this is documented. This fellow, Le Pétomane, was able to actually breathe in through his butt and ingest thereby a quantity of air sufficient to actually play music. I'm told that he actually got all the way in his advanced training, all the way through the Marseillaise. But he was also noted for playing impromptu bel cantos and operatic arias. And before you know it, he became the hit of Paris and was employed at the Moulin Rouge, no less. He was an overnight smash. His act is said to have been so funny that it caused at least one man to die of a heart attack due to uncontrollable laughter. Countless women fainted at both the hilarity and spectacle of Le Pétomane's 90-minute show. There was no nudity or shockingly exposed body parts. After all, this was fin de siècle France. No, Pujol would appear fully dressed on stage in formal wear. The only abnormality in regards to his clothing, well, we won't even talk about that. But he got into trouble. After 2 years with the Moulin Rouge and was expelled, there was a brief episode of a woman attempting to emulate his success, but it was found that under her petticoats, she had hidden a bellows. Oh, anyway, there have it. Uh,
Woohoo!
And I know I can't go on forever with this, but it was a serious form of entertainment.
And still is.
And apparently for some people. Still is. So finally, I'd like to talk about our friends, the cows. Because particularly in this age of the green,
Everything.
what is it? Yeah,
Everything.
everything. Yes, about our atmosphere. Cows are getting a really, you might say, bum steer. These are my favorite cows. And I really want to tell you what's going on with them. Do not really fart. They do occasionally, of course, but the main thing they do is belch. And my cat is now going to try to drink my Cabernet, so I'm going to move it. Yeah, cows, as you know, are ruminants, which means that they have a whole series of stomachs.
Yeah.
And that is a required anatomy for digesting basically grass and all the other stuff that they eat. And the result of that is a fair amount of belching on the part of the cows. They belch methane primarily, and are said to be responsible for about 22% of all the methane emissions that come out of biological causes. So they've kind of gotten a bad name. But it's important, I think, to be specific about the various greenhouse gases and what their actual components are. And carbon dioxide is by far and away almost 8 times more present than methane in the atmosphere. And it persists in the atmosphere. It simply doesn't degrade. Methane is a more potent atmospheric warmer, but it degrades. And so I think with the cow situation, we have to kind of modify our attitude and say we shouldn't blame them entirely for global warming. Neither should we who eat beans, because their production is primarily hydrogen. We shouldn't feel that by eating beans, we are contributing to global warming either. And so I leave you with this final message: eat more beans. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, if silent. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
We weren't silent in the chat, Bill. There's lots of great things. And a big shout out to Bob Conti, who found the farter on YouTube and posted the link in our chat section. You can scroll through, and when the evening is over, don't do it yet, you'll be able to see the master at work, according to Bob's research. So thank you, Bob. Very thorough. You're hired.
Wow. How can you top that? I wonder if that guy was just a one-hit wonder or he knew other songs. But and the other thing that is kind of puzzling to me, Bill, with your story was how hard and how far would you have to look to find 10 subjects being 1/2 male and 1/2 female? That must have been quite a chore too. But that's probably a telling for another time.
Well, it just goes to show you, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it just goes to show you that people will volunteer for anything.
Well, I've been trying to keep us somewhat on schedule, Rainey, and it's 7, and I want to give a chance for some feedback from those who have remained with us. But if I might, can I just tell one more story? Because it's kind of a personal story in that it's a family story. Is that
Yeah,
all
we're
right?
not in a hurry to get off. We didn't
All
put
right,
an
all
end
right,
time, so
all right.
you're good to go.
Well, I grew up, as some knew, in Northeast Harbor, where Mom and Dad ended up settling after they left Seal Harbor. But Dad was from Deer Isle, Mom was from Penobscot. And over in Penobscot, Mom's family had I guess you would call it a saltwater farm, as many of the people did in that time, where if you had a shotgun and a clam hoe and a garden and whatever else, you could probably get enough from the earth, from the land and the sea to feed the family for the year round. And so there were a lot of gardens that were being grown by everybody in town. And at some point during the course of all this, I guess people would become somewhat competitive with their gardens or with their hunting prowess or fishing. And on this particular night, and I think it must have been, for the purposes of the story, it must have been a Saturday night. And they had Gramp, Sidney Varnum, and Estella had their supper. Gramp had come in from working in the gardens all day. Had probably picked up a dish and taken it to the sink so that Graham could wash it, and then retired to the front porch, where he would often sit in his rocking chair and light up a bowl in his pipe and just look off to the westward and watch the sunset and ruminate about the day and maybe what was going to happen tomorrow. And this is the setting where he was when all of a sudden he looked off to the north and he saw what looked to be a big bank of fog coming in from the north. Well, that in itself was strange because that's not the way that fog typically came into Penobscot. And the fact that it was traveling south, everything just didn't seem right. He watched it and watched it until eventually it was right out in front of his house. And he, from the inside of this fog, he heard, "Whoa!" And it continued to move along, but kind of get less dense until he first saw the ears and then the head of a horse and then the horse's whole body and then the wagon and the fellow jumping down out of the seat on the wagon. He got down onto the road and jumped across the ditch and was coming up across the lawn in a pretty good clip and about to come up the stairs, and Gramp recognized him as his neighbor, Clarence Leach, at a farm up the road. Clarence runs up the steps, kind of all out of breath, like there's an emergency, and he says, Sidney, I've come to ask a favor of you. Gramp rocked in his chair and he says, "Oh, really, Clarence? What is it?" Well, he says, "You know that plot of land I got up on the hill? Well, I tilled that up this spring and I planted some squash up there." "Oh, you have? Yeah. Well, those squash have grown so big that I can't get them into the wagon. And I was wondering if I might be able to borrow your crosscut saw, Sidney. I know you got one. So I can cut them in two and load them into the wagon and get them home for winter." Gramp just rocked and looked at him a little bit. He says, "Well, Clarence, I guess you can have it if you can get it. But right now, you see, it's down in my garden, pinched in a beet." So that's kind of the understated competition that they would have at that time.
Caught in the beat.
Pinch means it's jammed in a beet and he couldn't get it. Never mind.
Got it.
I loved it. I thought it was, I like it. Pinched in a
Well,
beat's my
you know,
favorite saying.
For those who want to write in, I'll explain it to you a little later. All right. So, Earl, have you got anything that you want to add to the
Well,
night?
I think, we talked about the lumber camps, and of course with beans that many times a day, they were probably as good an expert on on French Impressionism as Bill is. And I think that there's a great story that actually the world record for largest outhouse is in Allagash, Maine, in a logging camp. It was an 8-holer. And
Wow.
farms might have had 4-holers with different ones for mom, dad, and the kids, but there's a great story about how Bert was in there after a big bean supper one night and pawing through the Sears catalog, and Abner comes flying in. The beans had really been working on him, and he shucked down his trousers and plopped down on one of those open seats. And as he did, all the change came out of his pocket and went down the hole. Well, Abner didn't say too much and finished up what he needed to do. And just like any job, of course, it's not done till the paperwork's complete. And Abner got up and shucked up his trousers, and Bert, still wasn't saying anything. And Abner opened his wallet and took a $10 bill out and threw it down the hole. And that got Bert curious. And Bert said, "Abner, why'd you do that?" And Abner says, "You don't think I'm going down there just for change, do you?"
Thank you. So I'm wondering if any in the audience, those of you who are brave enough to stay with us, have any recipes that you might want to share with us of the beans that you got and cooked from the recipe book that came with this sign-on material, or anything else that you'd like to add, or questions you might have too.
There's an opportunity. You can either put them in the chat feature, or you're welcome to turn your microphones off and use that. If you're particularly Zoom savvy, you'll know at the bottom you have a reactions. You can raise your hand or put a thumbs up, or you can also use your hand as a thing and raise it, and we'll see if your video's on, we can call on you. But yeah, please feel free, as Dennis said, to participate and share some. What were your prompts? What are they sharing?
I think Cookie has one.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to Jay's white chicken chili. A+, we tried it.
Oh, is that what you tried tonight?
No, but another night.
Okay. So that's in the cookbook.
All right, that's in there?
Yep.
It is, yeah.
Jay, invite us over. Anybody else? Got any comments or questions? Oh,
We've had great comments in the chat section.
Wait,
Julia.
Liz.
Oh, hold on, Liz.
Liz McMullen has something.
So
Go ahead.
I can't eat normal baked beans because they have pork in them. So I'm totally into vegetarian beans. And I grew up in the 50s here on the island with a man that was well ahead of his time. And he always bought things from Walnut Acres. And we had whole wheat everything. We had organic peanut butter. We grew up with everything in the 50s, if you can imagine. And we even had a farm so we could raise everything that we could eat, et cetera, et cetera. So about 6 months ago, I'm going down through the organic section of Hannaford's, and I see Walnut Acres, which was bought out a long time ago because they want to get rid of it, baked beans. And I bought a can, and they have no pork in them, and they're the most delicious thing in the world. And then they weren't there. And just this week, they're back on that shelf. And I have bought 6 cans, so there are not many left. And if you are not able to eat pork, or you want a vegetarian and you can't cook your own beans, Walnut Acres organic baked beans are to die for.
Oh, I like the recommendation.
Kaveh wants to add something.
Well, you have to also do a disclaimer that you don't take any money from these people. Anyhow, thank you very much, Dr. Horner. That was lovely listening to you, and as well, my wonderful friend. The things that is going on right now, MIT has done a tremendous amount of studies, and now they figured out a particular seaweed that you add in the cow's food, and that way you get a lot less methane generated, so they are reducing the cow's hoof prints. I'm not kidding, this is true.
Anyways,
So we had
Thank
a
you.
comment from Julia Gray in the chat section, hold on, Bill, where she says she recalls coming across something in her research about a project in Lubec that local luminary Rad Pike did some work toward developing a gasless bean. Don't know if anyone knows about that.
Hmm.
No, what's the point of a gasless bean, huh?
Yeah.
All right. Bill, yeah.
Actually, today I tried to get some quantitative information about which beans are gassier than others. I mean, there must be a sliding scale somewhere. And, but it didn't cover the full gamut. But black beans, soybeans, is there a bean that begins with M that it's a very short word? Apparently those are the biggest offenders. But as a
Mung bean.
Mung bean, they're saying, yes.
Yeah, mungs. Stay away from mungs unless, well, at least
They're good for sprouting. They're good for sprouting.
You want to tell them what you gave me for my birthday?
Well, hang on just a sec. I just want to say this. I was a physician at one time, and I like to give out useful medical information, particularly of the preventive sort. And remember I said that the small intestine lacks this alpha glucosidase or whatever it's called. I've lost my notes and I can't remember it already, but anyway, it's that essential enzyme that breaks down the oligopolysaccharide in the bean. There's a product called Beano that is that enzyme. And so if you take a couple of Beano tablets ahead of time, you can mitigate some of the side effects.
Eric is showing us a jar of Beano right there. Thank you, Eric. That's helpful. And in the chat feature, Julia found the gasless beans. She's shared a link to us for Rad Pike's gasless beans.
The other thing I would say, and that's the second and only thing, is that there's also another product called Gas X. Entirely different thing. That is simethicone. And basically it does nothing more than break up one into a million.
Okay.
At least you laugh.
Rob, Kate Jordan says Rob adds baking soda and that works as a secret tip. Pave seems to be agreeing.
Well, so I'll just say that my beloved husband gave me for my 75th birthday.
Only one of the things I gave.
Yeah, but he gave me a very romantic present for my 75th birthday. It's a pair of socks that says I never fart.
Well, the other thing we can do is soak up the beans and every 3 hours drain them, or add vinegar to it while you do that. That also takes some of that bad stuff and neutralizes it chemistry-wise.
Yeah, Donna suggests soaking beans for a full, I'm assuming maybe a full 24 hours in salted water as being essential.
Wow, there's been a lot of thought put into that.
There is, and I have to say, I have to admit I'm a West Coaster. So for me, some of these New England bean recipes are a little bit different, and I like a spicier bean. And so I find it fascinating the debate between a sweet bean, baked bean, or a salty baked bean, or a spicy baked bean. That to me was a very interesting debate. New to Maine.
I don't know, Dennis.
Well,
I don't know, Dennis. What about this West Coaster thing? I think that's a euphemism for something.
yeah, for something else, I'm not sure. I wish I'd known about that before I agreed to sign on to this. Nonetheless, there has been a lot of thought put into it, Bill. That's plain, and there's been quite a bit of experimentation as well. And I think it comes out to, if you like beans, eat them.
Well, that's a great maybe final note to end on. If you like beans, eat them. I see lots of clapping going on for those who have their videos going.
I do have one final thing, though. I hate to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but I'm going to, because I don't know how long I'm going to live. But the fact is, I said this at the beginning, and I meant it then, and I mean it again now, and I think it bears repeating. The MDI Historical Society is a great organization, and I know that you and Tim, the previous director, and certainly Bill, I didn't mean that you were off the board. I just meant that you weren't the chair anymore. I didn't think you were.
He
But
is. Stop demoting him.
He still is the chair?
Yes, stop
Oh,
demoting him. We still need him.
Listen, you've got to have term limits. At some point, you've got to have term limits.
I agree.
So, but my point is that whole organization has done such a wonderful job of educating, retaining the history. Don't give it away. I mean, don't lose it. We can't lose what is ours, and that ours is our history. So I would encourage people who are still with us, if you're not a member of the MDI Historical Society, you ought to consider joining. If you don't want to join an organization, and there's some people who don't, you ought to consider contributing to it, because they do a great job. And I guess that's what I want to end with. And I want to thank you, Rainey and Bill and Sharon and Earl and everybody who's joined us for making this baked bean supper, which is so non-traditional, making it a chance for us to get together, at least in this venue and in this format, during these darker days that are going to be lighter soon. So
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. I think I just have to say we weren't sure how this was going to work out. And despite a couple of glitches with the PowerPoint presentation piece, it's been so great to see everyone smiling and laughing and making comments in the chat section and the exchange. And we don't want to do it this way again, but I'm so glad we did it this way this year, and that it worked out, and that so many of you have come out and contributed recipes. Thank you to everyone who contributed a recipe. I really hope that those of you who get the cookbook with your tickets dig in and spend some time playing with some of those recipes and adjusting them and making them your own. There's some really fabulous things in there. And thank you to each of our speakers for making this night fun and funny and silly. And lots of thanks are showing up in the chat section as well. So anybody have a different last comment they want to make, or something that you feel pressed that you didn't get a chair yet? Robert Jordan, and it looks like, are you just piecing out, or are you raising your hand?
Sharon has a hand up.
All right. Oh yeah, Sharon.
I want to add a last minute thought, added to all of the last minute thoughts about, wouldn't it be nice if the only thing that the world was fighting about was how to make baked beans?
That's a good point, whether beans should be sweet or not. Good point. Well, all of you, please stay safe and enjoy the rest of January. And we look forward to seeing everybody on the other side of all of this crazy historic period of time. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
See you later.
And this for everybody.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you.